Today we're going to be talking about sort of my journey for the last number of years, transitioning from being a still photographer into being a videographer. And I want to tell you sort of the roadblocks and the things that I had to overcome, and I'm still overcoming. So the first thing, I have to get this out of the way because it's such a big area, but the first thing we want to talk about is audio recording. So I began my journey as far as audio recording, helping other people out. And helping other people out is a great way to learn. But what are some of the big tips that I could say you're going to have to run into this and deal with it? Well, I would say, first of all, buy a good pair of headphones. Headphones are probably number one. And then number two, buy a good audio interface like this one. This is a Motu M2, really good audio interface. And what I'd recommend is getting an accurate audio interface like this, and getting a good pair of headphones, an accurate pair of headphones. All right, you need something accurate. And from there, when you make a recording on whatever type of recorder you're using, you can start to get a feel for what's going on. And that's the number one thing, is practice, practice, practice. But audio is going to be a big thing because a lot of people say that audio is even more important than video. I think that they're both equally important. But the point is, you're going to learn. And a few resources I'd like to recommend for learning on YouTube include, number one, Curtis Judd is just excellent. Learn light and sound. Search for Curtis Judd on YouTube and you'll have some good information. Number two, DSLR video shooter. Caleb is just excellent as well. He also covers a number of these other things I'm going to talk about in regard to learning the differences between still photography and video. Now, by the way, Curtis Judd came from a similar background that I came from. He started in still photography, and so there's a ton of good material on his YouTube channel about transitioning and about taking your lighting skills and putting them over in the area of video. So while you do have to learn this as a new skill, it's pretty exciting, and I think you can do it. So the good news is most of the rest of this video is going to talk about skills that do transfer over from still photography to video. And let's start with number two. So number two here is how to make people look their best on camera and how to master lighting faces. So good camera angles, flattering poses, these are all things that can be transferred from still photography. Okay, next is one of the most controversial issues to me as a photographer becoming a videographer, and that is how to use horizontal versus vertical composition. Now, I say this is controversial because cell phone use, vertical video is one of the most controversial issues for photographers especially, right? And even more so for videographers. So if you haven't seen that movie, I highly recommend it, except there are a few sort of bleeped out words, but I think it's a good point in a general sense, and it's very funny. So I'll just leave it with that. But let me tell you some practical things about, from my experience, about vertical versus horizontal. So I started out as a food and product photographer, and I was working on a team where I would go do the still photography and a videographer would come with me and we would work together to do the videos. So what I found out very quickly is that when I shot vertically, he could not do a pan and scan move on the food shot. And at the time, it was very important. These still photos were actually more important than they are today. But back then, 4K video didn't exist. So when you took a still photo that was like 10,000, a 10 megapixel image and you moved on it, it looked like, whoa, that is just sharper video than you've ever seen, right? So you really had an advantage by shooting a still photo that you could move on. But if you shot vertically, we found that cropping options were very limited. There were a lot of other applications too. I was a graphic designer at the time working with those images, and for page layout, for cropping, just different options, there were not many things you could do with a vertical photo. And so we quickly moved to doing horizontal shots. So if you're a photographer who can make the transition from shooting vertically to horizontally, I highly recommend it, and it'll give you a jump start on video composition. So let's talk about the next thing. How to choose and use the right lens, and how to use prime lenses in low light. So using prime lenses in low light is a great, what you might call a segue to another one of these points I'm going to make, but it's one of the biggest things I had a problem with, and that is transitioning from flash photography to using lights like these. So when you have to carry one of these around, it's a little more of a problem than carrying one of these around, but it's worth it. But more on the topic of shooting, with different lenses and learning what those lenses do, I think that's why still photographers kind of have a running start in this area, because they picked up so many lenses. They have to change lenses quickly, and they're just used to picking the right lens for the right situation. But now let's talk about something that's a little more difficult in the area of transitioning from still photography to video, and that is learning to focus pull. So while focusing manually is part of some still photography, although it's become less and less since autofocus, you'll also need to learn how to use a camera rig. And yes, you can get away with less of a rig with smaller camera gear. I totally encourage that, but it is something that you have to learn. So let's now talk about what lighting skills transfer from stills to photography. And we already kind of hinted at it here with the flash, and talking about constant light source versus strobe, but this is a really big part of it. So while strobe and flash techniques may not transfer, there are a number of things that do, such as the position of the light, the size of the light, the distance of the light, the color of the light. Those are all things that, coming from still photography to video, it's a very valuable set of skills that you're bringing over. Now for the next one, let's talk about stabilization. So with video, stabilization is an even bigger problem, but I'm going to give you some good news in a second here about that as well. So this was one of the most difficult things for me to learn when transitioning from still photography to video, because not only was I having trouble keeping the camera steady, but I was also moving from one place to another, not staying in one place long enough. Now that's a different topic, but in video production, stabilization is huge. It is probably, I guess it would be, in my experience, the most difficult transition from one to the other, because there's a whole bunch of tricks you can do in still photography to eliminate camera shake. Number one, you can use a higher shutter speed. Number two, you can use high sync flash, and you can actually ignore all the ambient light and just use the exposure from the flash units and get a perfectly crisp image, because there is no ambient light to blur. But here's the good news. So in-body stabilization is now becoming the norm in DSLR-style cameras, mirrorless-style cameras. Canon just came out with I don't want to date this video too much, but they just came out with the R6, the R5, and the whole thing about in-body stabilization is that you can use smaller gimbals, lighter weight tripods. You can even handhold some shots, and it's just amazing. So this, I think, is going to make it so much easier for people to learn videography, especially if you're coming from still photography and you don't have all these tricks that you used to do. But with in-body stabilization, all that changes, and it is so neat. So let's get into the next skill that does transfer from still photography to video. And that is the skill or the habit of carrying equipment. So while there is additional equipment that you have to carry for video production, if you start out in still photography and you're used to lugging big gear, So now let's talk about number 9, using a DSLR style camera versus a video camera. So there's a lot to be said in this area, but the main thing I want to talk about is DSLRs. Are they better than video cameras? if we're talking about video cameras versus DSLR cameras being used for video, we bring up a big subject. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about it because there's a lot of, it's still out for debate. So my approach is, coming from a still photographer, I'm fine with using a DSLR style camera for video. I mean, I'm used to having it on a tripod. I'm used to not zooming while shooting even. And you know, most movies are made like that, right? They don't typically zoom during a shot. Anyway, next thing is, what about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO? So using aperture, shutter speed, ISO for video, it's a little bit different, but I want to encourage you that a lot of the skills that we have as still photographers about how these combine still come into play. They're all going to affect the exposure. But now let's talk about, when you go to video, what happens, at least what happened to me. You say, okay, what's frame rate? How does frame rate come into this? Well, let me talk about something really quickly here called the 180-degree rule. And what the 180-degree rule means is pretty much you take your frame rate, you double it, and that's the shutter speed you choose. So if you want more information about this, Caleb Pike DSLR video shooter has an awesome video that is the way I finally got it into my head about frame rate and shutter speed, how it works for video. The simple answer is that frame rate is not the same as shutter speed, but there's that simple rule to basically make your shutter speed twice the frame rate. So I know there's a little bit more to it than that when you have to transition from being a still photographer to doing video. But in the words, slightly modified words of Red Green, I'm a photographer, but I can change if I have to. So that's it, guys. Remember, if you like this video, please like it. Tell your friends. Hey, tell that photographer who you want to encourage, perhaps, that he can make it in the transition from photography to video, or maybe that's yourself. I'm in that seat right now. So that's it, guys. Have a good day.